Good afternoon and welcome to the State Allocation Board Subcommittee hearing on the Department of Defense schools. At the April 25th State Allocation Board meeting, staff from the California Department of Education and the United States Department of Defense Office of Economic Adjustment presented a report to the board regarding the Department of Defense Facilities Program for base schools. At the meeting, Patrick O'Brien, Director of the Office of Economic Adjustment, indicated to the State Allocation Board that 4 of the 7 projects do not have their 20% match and asked the state for assistance. The State Allocation Board formed this subcommittee on the issue to report back to the full board regarding the possibility of providing the 20% match requirement. It's important to note that the Department of Defense did a very comprehensive assessment of the facilities and looked at the needs of the whole school, which is a different approach than how the school facility program in California works in terms of a per pupil allocation. Therefore, the 20% match is a higher amount than what the district share would typically qualify for under a school facility program calculations. I've been serving as the California's liaison with the Department of Defense and have met with the individual school districts to discuss the needed improvements at each of the schools. This is a very unique situation and a viable opportunity to leverage federal funds to support the children of our military families who are in need of our help with their school facilities throughout our state. My hope is that we can come up with some viable options to take advantage of this one-time opportunity, and that's the purpose of the subcommittee hearing today. We have a staff report that staff has really looked at what our possibilities are, and I know we'll go over that, but first I would just like to ask Rob Hertzfeld from the Office of Economic Adjustment to give us a brief overview of the program, and then go to Ms. Silverman to talk about the staff report, and then we can discuss it, unless there's any opening remarks that my fellow subcommittee members would like to make. Okay. Rob?
Thank you for your consideration of our program on such a quick schedule. The staff of OPSC, your staff, and Kathleen Moore and her staff at the Department of Education has done a phenomenal job in a very short amount of time learning about our program and jumping in to try to understand about how the programs can work together well. The program is a tremendous opportunity that came about very quickly. Unusual for the federal government in the time that they're cutting substantial amounts of money, and we've been working on continuing resolutions and not being able to get a budget. It just shows the need and the demands and Congress's intent that education and schools for our military kids is the highest priority. During the last budget reconciliation issue that they had in April of 2001, when they cut all other parts of the federal budget, they gave us $250 million to start up a program quickly to address the critical needs at the most critical schools. We stood up the program rather quickly. In September, we had a program announcement of how we're going to implement this program, September of 2011, and we invited the first 12 schools on our priority list of the worst condition and capacity schools within our portfolio. The proposals from that initial round were due in January, and we spent the last couple months reviewing those proposals, and in the first round of 12 schools we've agreed on a project scope for those projects. In February of this year, in the most recent budget reconciliation bill, Congress gave us another $250 million to add to this program while cutting many other departments of the federal government. We had a program announcement where we invited round 2 schools to come in for a similar session we had last September, and those proposals are due the end of this month, and we will start the review process. So you can see we have $500 million that we quickly implemented into a program and trying to get it out in the field, in part because we're worried, not only because of the need, but we're worried that if we don't obligate the money sooner rather than later, with the tremendous budget problems that the Department of Defense is facing with the sequestration in January, that they may take the money away if we haven't spent it and obligated it. So it's critically important for us to try to get the grants approved and obligated, which is basically at a different timeline than your normal system, and that's why we've asked for your assistance quickly, and you've responded, and we really appreciate that. Out of the top 24, which is the top $500 million in our program, 7 of those schools are in California. It is by far and away the most out of any state in our portfolio. Potentially, we're looking at, under the grant requests, almost 30% of that $500 million going to schools in California. Out of the next top 33, which on our list is considered, in the report you'll see we ranked our schools by condition and capacity. And yellow for condition, yellow for capacity would take us down to 39 schools. In the most current budget resolution by the House Appropriation Bill, they've appropriated another $270 million for our program. The administration had requested 40. That would take us down for another 9 schools, of which 4 of them are in California. So as you can see, this is a rather robust program, and California is up at the top of the list if we can respond by dealing with some of these critical shortfalls in the local communities about not being able to meet the match. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hertzfeld. And can you just remain at the table in case there's questions that come up during the course of our piece today that would be most appropriately answered by yourself? So with that, Lisa,
yeah, I'd like to.
Vaughn, do you want to take us through the staff report?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and do an introduction. As you know, we obviously did have an opportunity to meet with the Department of Defense and Department of Education prior to the last April board meeting, and it gave us a better understanding of what the program was going to offer, but we actually had a lot more dialogue after that to trying to get a grasp of what options that we have for any programs that we can potentially fund or match fund. Obviously, the state program is a different program. Unlike the federal program, our shoes don't fit in the same box. So trying to create some opportunities of whether or not what shoes can fit in what box is kind of what we've kind of laid out here. And with that, I'll have Michael Watanabe walk over the funding considerations.
Okay, I'll start on page 4. Before we get into the different kind of things our staff has considered, let's start with the chart on page 4 and kind of the issue we're trying to solve. Based on our discussions with the district and the Department of Defense, in that 4th column there at the bottom, we're trying to get the total projects for these 7 schools is about $205 million. Just multiplying that out by about 20%, you come to $41 million. In our discussions with the districts, 2 districts have a little bit of contribution. San Diego has indicated that through potentially a November bond, they can come up with their match for their project. In the second to last column, we've kind of taken their district's baseline eligibility for new construction modernization and kind of multiply that out by the base grants. What could they potentially be eligible for? Now, as we pointed out, the Department of Defense program, the school facility program, fund in a different way. So our staff, if an application were to come in, would have to look at those scopes to see if they can reach this full potential. If not, the shortfall would actually be greater for these districts. Assuming they can totally qualify for all the eligibility that we have on the books currently for them, the last column there is indicating the shortfall we're trying to solve at this point, which is about $28.7 million. On page 5, we have received 1 application for a modernization project from Sierra Sands for their Burroughs High project. They're requesting about $4.9 million in state funding. What you'll see on the what we've added as an attachment D this morning is we've been able to update our workload list that OPSC is processing in-house. And as it's looking right now, this project would be outside the available bond authority, but we can go to that in a minute. So under the considerations on page 5 that staff looked at, the first idea we looked at was can reserve bond authority. In Education Code, it actually defines an apportionment as a reservation of funds for the use of eligible new construction, modernization, and hardship approved by the board for an applicant's school district. In our discussions with legal counsel, just straight reserving bond authority by providing these apportionments would be in conflict with the statutory definition of an apportionment. Our program does have conceptual approvals through the facility hardship program, but there's no reservation of bond authority. It's just an approval by the board that you meet the basic requirements of the program. You still have to walk in the future with a funding application to receive an apportionment. Another mechanism we have reserve bond authority in our program is preliminary apportionments, and currently there are 4 programs within the school facility program where we can actually reserve bond authority prior to the project meeting all the other requirements of the program. Those 4 programs are the Charter School Facilities Program, the Joint Use Program, the Critically Overcrowded School Program, and the Career Technical Education Facility Programs. 3 of those programs, the preliminary apportionments, are defined in statute, which allows us to provide those under their Career Tech Education Facility Program. There's actually regulation allowing reservations of funds prior to DSA and CDE approval. The Education Code defines preliminary apportionment as an apportionment made for eligible applicants in advance of full compliance with all the application requirements otherwise required for a full apportionment. So what we did is we looked at those statutes and the regulations and thought about, can we apply that to new construction and modernization projects, which is where these Department of Defense projects would fall with. Currently, the Education Code is doesn't define or contemplate them for preliminary apportionments for new construction or mod, but right now they are outside the current framework of the program. On the top of page 6, we proposed a couple ideas that the subcommittee could consider. We could pursue a legislative change to the entire Leroy Green Act, the school facility program, and create a mechanism for preliminary apportionments for these projects. Obviously, there would be a time involved in that. The second idea that we could possibly reach is we can redefine what an apportionment is in regulations. Right now, the apportionment is defined in regulation as the same meaning as it is in statute. But somehow we could look at the mechanics of changing that definition, and that would be within the board's ability.
Michael, that's to change it to include the possibility of a preliminary apportionment.
Correct. The mechanics of that would, rather, that'd be a big change, because right now the word apportionment is used so much in our, 150 pages of regs, we'd have to do it carefully, but we think that there provides a little bit of room there to try that route if that's the desire. There's a chart there on page 6. If we choose to go the route of reserving bond authority, one of the challenges is the time that would be involved to make that happen. As of our April board meeting, we had $388.8 million remaining in modernization bond authority. Based on the applications we received in-house and what school districts have requested, they requested over $420 million in modernization funding. That leaves us about $32.1 million beyond the authority authorized by the voters.
And Michael, could you, just while we're here, could you say where Sierra Sands project falls in the $32 million overage?
They're on attachment D. Let me get a page number for you. Oh, page 59. They're the 5th project down, and that puts them approximately $18 million beyond the authority.
So they're in the middle of this 32, or roughly in the
Correct.
middle of this 30,
Correct.
little more than middle of this 32.
Right.
Okay.
And keep in mind, as we go through our review process, we're looking at several hundred projects here. The grants go up and down, more often not up and down. So they're not, I wouldn't say they're out of hope at this point yet. And we also do our closeout reviews too that potentially return authority. So right now that's just where they're at until we get a chance to process them. I can go into the other considerations, or we can talk about that one.
No, go ahead,
Okay.
unless there's questions. Any questions from board members?
Yeah, one of the things maybe in your briefing to us, I'm just wondering about the apples and oranges match here. You know, is there certain, I know that criteria to find out if a school needs to be modernized is different than what ours are, but even if we were able to somehow, you know, come up with this, the money matching, does it even fall within our preview or meet the state standards that we have to abide by, and how's that match up with those things? I know modernization is something different than what we may have, you know, those type of things. So more about the definitions, and we'll go from there.
It is different, and the simple version is that the definition of need under the school facilities program for modernization is based on the ages of the buildings. If it's a permanent classroom, it has to be at least 20 years, 25 years or older. If it's a portable, 20 years or older to qualify for funding. That is really it. We also take into consideration the enrollment at each school site. It's on a per-site basis, and that's what's used right now under the GREEN Act, under our program. And Mr. Hirschfeld can speak more towards the federal standards in terms of defining need, but it's my understanding it's based on the, not just the condition, but also the capacity. I don't know if you'd like to elaborate on the federal determination on the need.
Yeah, just our program looked at capacity numbers, and if it was, excuse me, a portable, that was not counted in as for capacity consideration. So one of the major things that in California that this program will be doing is basically eliminating or transferring portables to permanent, which, as I understand, is one of the goals of the California standards. Just you haven't had the money to do that.
Well, our critically overcrowded school and overcrowded relief grant programs were in place for that type of purpose.
Correct.
And I think you did look at whether these 7 school districts were eligible in those programs and did not find eligibility there for them. Is that correct?
That's
as well?
That's correct.
So I think really what, in answering to Assemblymember Hagman's question, is that in the inbox thinking of our program, or not the inbox thinking, but the inbox environment of our program, there's about potentially 11 million in eligibility between the projects that most likely could probably to some extent be similar types of work, because the work in these programs are considered modernization programs. There may not be, it might not all be there, but that's our greatest piece right there, is the 11 million in eligibility that would be perfected from the program. And the timing issue for us, and again is the apples and oranges question, is that the Department of Defense requires the commitment up front and actually sets aside the funding up front. And in our program, we say you must be out of the Division of State Architect, and we set aside the funding at the end. And so it's that issue of when could we potentially commit to these districts if we want to. And then that's where Mr. Watanabe is giving the option of possibly having a preliminary apportionment that really sets aside up to 11 million in eligibility in these for these projects, and makes that commitment, and then when they're ready with their DSA approved plans would provide that funding. And then you can go through I think that's where we are so far. And then whether there's any possibility, I think in any of our funds, is the other question was, well, that leaves the rest, the 28 million, I think in your last column, the shortage, the funding shortage. And is there anything in our program that can help with that? And I know you've really exhausted that investigation.
And we all want the same goal here, is to, capitalize on this, but also, I want to talk about the fairness of, do we put these people in front of everybody else who's been waiting patiently for years to come as well? I mean, where do you go from there?
Now, right now, the only school district that's in the queue is Sierra Sands.
That's correct. That's correct.
And they're in the negative queue
right
as far as available funding.
Right. And so in order for us to move them over to the active workload list, we need to have bond authority to do that at this point in time.
And what's the Fed's drop dead date on financial commitment on the match?
We're already holding up. We basically are ready to move forward with a grant process for one of the schools, but we can't because they don't have the match.
So how long are you willing to continue to wait? Weeks, months?
There's not an easy answer to that because the longer we
Is
wait,
6 months okay?
I don't think so with the way that our money could get taken away.
5 months, maybe 4 months, 3 months at the most? Your fiscal year ends in September. Does that matter?
It doesn't matter per se because our dollars are what they call know your money. However, with the constraints, with the severe cuts in the Department of Defense, the fear is that in January they're going to go with the meat slicer and slice out anything that has not been spent. The quicker we can get to a grant agreement and a commitment, they can't take the money away once we already have it approved.
So we have till September at best?
I would say July at best, to be honest with you.
Okay.
Our intent was to take this back before the full board in July because I thought that was my understanding that the Department of Defense really needed that commitment by that point for these projects.
And the other thing that maybe I didn't explain well enough is our money has to be spent in order. The list that's attached to your package that ranks school under our specific authority, we're not supposed to fund someone lower down on the list until we funded the schools higher up on the list because we need to make sure that we're going in this rank order. So
the ones that are this round I think they're in order on our page 4 with Sierra Sands, right? Murray Middle School is the first.
Yeah.
Yes.
Forbes and Burroughs. These 3 were in the first grouping of the $250 million, and the remaining 4 were in the second grouping of the $250 million. So the critical ones right now, and well, all of them are, but are the Murray, Forbes, and Burroughs. And of those, really, it was it's the Muroc Joint Unified that really has no capacity for any part of their match, and they have $232,000 from a previous savings on a mod project that they could put towards their project.
So getting back to the reality check, we need to commit funds by no later than the end of July, so we've got a month. The only project in the queue that can possibly meet that timeline is Sierra Sands, and that would require us putting them in front of everyone else. Is that right?
That's correct currently because they're on the negative side of the list. If there was a will to move them up, then that means somebody on the active workload list would have to get dropped in order to push them in advance to get the authority committed to them, since they're already in the queue.
And since we're talking about 20%, I know normal state projects, we do the matching funds 50-50. But if the project comes below the amount that we budgeted for that, then the school district keeps the difference. And do we have any kind of statistics on what, because I know construction sites and everything else, I mean, everything's low right now as far as building. Do we have any kind of percentage of what those have been looking like? Did they design engineer for 80%? You know,
Unless the school district qualifies as a financial hardship, then yes, they get to keep the savings as part of the project, and they can apply that towards other high capital outlay projects.
have you seen any kind of numbers of what people have been doing lately coming in?
No, we haven't really done a study, although I know it was noted in an audit report that was done for the program about a year and a half ago. There was an estimate about $5 billion to $6 billion in savings in general related to the projects in the program.
And I could tell that should be one of the things we should change in next funding. We should be sharing that savings. We don't get a dime of that back, even though they cut back on the spending on it.
Bigger changes, right?
Can I? One of the things I wanted to ask Mr. Hertzfeld was, I mean, part of what I think is a solution that Mr. Watanabe looked at here and staff looked at is the idea of a preliminary apportionment, which would be that the state could make a commitment of dollars potentially for a project, and then we get into the issue, there's a timing issue related to the commitment represented by a preliminary apportionment and then actually getting the cash for the project. So, and the preliminary apportionment avenue by regulation change seems to be the most promising avenue to me as I look at this. How does that fit into the federal program in terms of the expenditure of funds, commitment, the cash flow, and how does it work with your program, Robert?
It's a good question. It's a brand new program. We've stood it up rather quickly. The good thing is we don't have 20 years of history of rules and regulations in practice, so we do have some flexibility. We are looking at trying to get a commitment. And I think we can structure the program to deal with contingencies if, the preliminary allocation, it's a commitment based upon the numbers coming in. And that's a lot better than having us sit and wait and not being able to proceed.
So
it is much better to get a firm commitment, but I think we could have flexibility if there is good faith effort put on both sides. We could meet that good faith. I can't speak for the department. I'm not the director, but I think we have some flexibility that we could work on.
I think, too, what Mr. Savage is asking is similar in our program is the fact that we apportion funds, and then typically school districts will wait a year to a year and a half when actual cash is available to follow those funds. They're taken in priority order and asked, when they're ready and can go directly to construction. So, in a similar vein, if our option were a preliminary apportionment that would set aside the possibility of those funds happen, let's say, by July, it's my understanding that the projects aren't ready to go. So your actual cash following that could be a year to a year and a half later and work within your system.
Yes, the cash does not need to be spent at the beginning of the process. Our grants typically work on a pro rata share basis, so that for every dollar of project costs, we pay 80 cents, you pay 20 cents. So it depends on the cash outlays of, for example, several of the projects have about a year of design work to go through. That's not where the major expense is. The major expense is in the construction of it. So I would say over the next year, the cash outlay requirement is not as great. However, we do have to set our grants at the beginning of the process.
But we would still, even with a preliminary funding commitment, that's still a approval of funding.
Yeah, and if I could follow up just a little bit on the process, another factor to consider is, let's say that the subcommittee were to recommend to the full membership that a preliminary apportionment process be developed. We're talking probably July SAB for the board to approve potentially regulations. Now, it doesn't mean that the regulations become effective at that board to even be able to begin accepting or approving. So you have board approval, then the regulatory process. I don't know, Ms. Jones can help us, even if it's on an emergency basis, if the board approves it in July, how quickly could the regulations become effective?
Well, with full cooperation from the control agencies, we could probably get it in effect within about 6 to 8 weeks, and that's with full cooperation.
So we're probably not looking at having an opportunity to approve funding till September.
Earliest, if it's on an emergency track. It could be later if they're not on an emergency track, but yeah, basically.
So will the feds wait that long, or will you have already moved on?
I can't answer that. I'm sorry.
So it would mean that in July, you would have an indication whether the board supported it or not. I mean, really, in July, if the board says, yes, we support this, and we'll start the regulatory process for this potential, it's an 8 weeks out, and in a good situation, and it may. I mean, that's something that you'll have to consider in terms of would this meet the commitment requirement, and with the knowledge that the board supported it and it's now in its regulatory structure, and then they would have to bring back the apportionments.
And because of the newness of the program, we have flexibility, and we really appreciate your efforts, and my instinct is would honor that.
So, Michael, is there any other, or Juan or Lisa, or Bill, of possibilities here? It seemed like we had teased out the best possibility to assist here. Is there any others?
I can go through the rest of the things we discussed, but none of them turned out to be viable. To your other question, is there other ways to fund these? Besides the school facility program, deferred maintenance program, emergency repair program, we don't have any other cash proceeds to provide to the districts and any other funding mechanisms through our office.
So, Assemblymember Buchanan, we have gone through looking at our greatest possibility, and that is that there's about $11 million worth of eligibility in various forms for some of the projects, and that in order to access that in this bond cycle, the greatest possibility we would have is maybe a preliminary apportionment, but that would require an infusion of authority coming back to the program, because right now we're how much into overage? 32 million in?
In modernization, 32 million.
We're 32 million in projects in-house that already exceed the modernization, of which Sierra Sands is one, and Sierra Sands is about 18 million out of the money at the moment. But it doesn't consider, rescissions and actual project costs and those kinds of things. They're very close. Sierra Sands is very close. And we don't know if any other funding would come back to the program. Particularly, I think the board's going to be considering some of that in the future on projects. And so that appears to be our greatest possibility. Fellow board members have raised some issues around fairness in that, and I'm willing to entertain more discussion on that if folks want to talk about that.
So could I? So we're 32 million over. 18 million of that is with Sierra Sands, so that.
No, they're 18 million mark of the 32.
They're 18 of the 32.
I'm not that amount of money. That's where they come in.
Right, I know, but they're okay.
And they're about 4.8.
Is this project part of that?
It could be part of it.
Is that part of it? So, but that doesn't. So that only reduces it by 1.8 million. For the 11.4, that only reduces it to 1.8. So if we're 32 million over and we need 11.5, so we would have to have 40. If we did add it to the bottom, we'd have to have roughly 45 million come back into the program. Correct.
Mm-hmm. So to reach them,
if everyone who has been apportioned funding
18 takes
that funding and completes their projects, then we're 32 short. The only way we do the 32 plus this 11.5 is if we had $44 million come back into the program.
Right.
Okay.
That is correct.
Right.
So, and I know I should know this because we went over it I don't know, over how many meetings in our new construction sub, but about how much is being returned to the program. We had some monthly numbers back then. Do you remember what they were?
On average, about $2 million a month, and it may be split between mod and new construction. I think some of our challenges that we have is, you know, we base our program, I think we shared earlier, is based on eligibility, and some of these projects do have eligibility and others don't have eligibility. Right. And even if you do have a preliminary apportionment, is how do you establish that eligibility in order to make up that match? That's part of our challenge as well. Even though if you have the ability to award a preliminary apportionment, you still have to have eligibility.
So when you say they don't have eligibility, is that because of the age of the buildings or?
That's correct. Some of them have already received funding under the program, so it uses up their eligibility. They don't have any remaining eligibility. Others, it could be that they just have buildings of age.
The $11 million that we're talking about, however, is eligible.
Correct.
I mean, that's potential eligibility.
Yes.
Not saying that
Right.
the projects come up
Right.
to that amount, but that's what staff has gleaned as the potential eligibility. The
Correct.
28 million on the other side of that isn't eligible.
Right.
And that's a greater problem that we have. And I think what we're trying to do is maximize the closest to eligible, the closest to our program that we can, and that's the 11 million. If you want to take on the 11 plus 28, that's a greater issue and that we have.
Can I go back to the timing
Yes.
issue? Because I'm looking at the timeline provided by the district for one of the Camp Pendleton projects, San Onofre, and if you look on page 45, they're not planning to commence construction until June of 2015. And so I guess I'd suggest that some of this, in terms of talking about bond authority, would probably fit within a new bond if we did a 2014 state bond. So it may be that when we look at where the need for authority lies, some of it may be in a future bond, and both of the Camp Pendleton schools have that similar time frame for their project. So 2015 start of construction.
Well, you could put all of it into a future bond if you wanted to.
True.
Right. I mean, you could create a DOD category and put this in and then take advantage of it for all the schools. If we were able to find the 11 million, then the trying to look at how much we're going to bring in.
11 million, the total value of
Right.
the projects is 205 million.
Right, but that also includes the ones that aren't eligible, correct?
That is
So
correct.
you'd have to, so you've got
I think it's, let's see, it's, of the projects that are eligible,
you've got roughly $100 million that are in projects that are eligible. Right,
so 10%.
right.
Well, that
No,
doesn't,
50.
no, it'd have to be if it was, yeah, that's right.
Throw out another question. Maybe you guys could just get back to me later on this. We talked about earlier about how these projects are coming under what we've been granting. A lot of them have been, according to the audit a year and a half ago, and just by street smart, so all the bids are coming in a lot less. Is there something we could do as a board to say we want to collect half that money back for some of the ongoing projects we have right now, our 50% match return?
The mechanism we have in place for the financial hardship program is for financial hardship, the savings come back to the program if they don't apply it to a future project. So that's one mechanism, but as far as your 50-50...
Do we have the authority to do that, though? I know what the current thing is, but...
That's within our authority, but to ask for savings to come back on the 50-50 program, that's a bigger change.
Is it doable, though?
It would require legislative change. It's in statute.
Makes no sense. Who would put that in the law?
And for the modernization program, having spent the last 13 years modernizing schools, there's no savings in the modernization program at school districts. The funds, and we're talking here all about modernization, none of these are new construction. The funds that districts receive from the state are not really totally adequate to modernize the schools, and districts are typically making contributions in excess of their 60% share.
So on Sierra Sands here, when I look at the list, the estimated grant amount is 4.9 million. The share that they need here, the 20% match, why is it 4.9 million on this sheet and 7.6 million?
That's what they applied
Their their calculated 20% is the 6.4 million.
Right.
Their potential grant eligibility modernization is 7.6 million. They've only requested half their grants on this current funding application.
Okay. And can that funding application be modified at all to request the full 7.6?
They'd have to submit another application.
They'd have to submit another one. Well, if I but is the 4.9 roughly, is that a subset of the 7.6?
Yes.
So if I subtract 4.8 or whatever from it, we'd need $6.6 million to be able to bring in $100 million in federal funds?
Considering that Sierra would get funded?
Well,
Is that what you're
if
saying?
you assume that, I mean, if they've got an application in
Right.
for the I put down 4.8, but 4.9, and that's a subset of the 7.6,
That's
right?
correct.
Then I could take the 11.4, subtract out the 4.8, which
Correct.
means I need we need $6.6 million.
Correct.
But again, our greatest challenge is
I know.
they need a funding approval next month. So there's a lot of things that have to happen in the next 30 days.
You'd have to change your regulation and give approval all at the same meeting. That's what you'd have to do. Now, at our meeting when we set up this subcommittee, it was also, the two other things, as I recall, were mentioned. One was that there are times when the federal government, due to hardship situations, will waive the 20%. Is that a possibility at all?
This is a brand-new program, so we don't have experience in implementing. However, when this program was originally set up, the demand was a 50% match. We, in essence, negotiated it with our controller that because of the special circumstances of the locations of military schools where
Right.
it's difficult to raise bond issues, we lowered it to 20. The commitment was that we would use all but extraordinary measures, and that to go less than that would take extreme circumstances. So we haven't issued any waivers yet. There's, out of the first 12, there have been 2 that have said that they would have difficulty in raising that 20%. One of them was in the state of Louisiana, where the state of Louisiana has put forth an effort like you're talking about doing now, with making a commitment to reach that match.
Okay.
The other state is going through the process right now. We have not issued a waiver, and they are trying to find the funds in a similar way that you have. So the clear answer is we haven't had any waivers, and we've been told to use that authority sparingly, if at all.
And if we made a motion to include this in a future bond, so, I mean, that we wouldn't be able to have assurances of the money for 2 years, would that satisfy the DOD? I mean, they're going to have to go through planning and approval processes before they can even go out to bid.
It's better than not, and we would appreciate the best efforts, and that would certainly show best efforts and intent.
Well, following on that too, I mean, I'm reading the little summaries of the financials, and school districts are not the best financial shape to begin with, to say the least on them, but some of them have got out in the past, but haven't, some others haven't in the last decade gone out for a bond. And this is specific to say, we're getting a new school on 20 cents on the dollar too.
Right.
I think that would give them some time too to try to muster up the local will, so to speak, if they have the capacity to. Some even have capacity for bonding, but they want to even
Well,
use it
they
at this
can
point.
use the beauty of this program is they can use the state school facilities program as the match, and they don't need a local bond to actually fix these schools.
Well, for a future bond, yes.
Right,
but I'm
for
saying
future
even
bonds,
now,
yeah.
I still would like to see if they could really,
Right.
get somebody
Yeah.
out of the base too.
I think that the future bond issue is a great possibility for those that don't qualify for our current bond issue. But our current bond monies that we know are vastly depleting, there's an 11 million possibility there. Particularly, I think, with the first, with Muroc, Sierra Sands, and Sierra Sands projects, because they're in the first grouping of projects.
Just a quick point of clarification. We were able to get a hold of Sierra Sands last week and find out the project scope of the project that's in-house beyond authority. That project is actually a reimbursement project on the district. It's not part of the Department of Defense project. So they would, if they were to get funded on that project, that 4.9 million would be reimbursing the district, and that 4.9 million they already spent would be used for the 6.4 million they need.
So it's a roundabout
So they
way to
don't
make their
quite
match.
need as much, yeah.
Right, which reduces
Which reduces the
what we
11
have to
million.
find to $6.6 million.
Right.
Are there other comments on the board?
Well, the federal grants that I'm familiar with on the matching funds are usually pretty strict about verifying the match. So what we're talking about here is a promise.
Yes.
When can you let us know if your grant officials would be okay with that?
We asked for a commitment to the dollars. We have not actually gone into their specific bank accounts and asked for it. And again, we started up this program real quickly. We literally had the program announcement last September. Out of the 12 that we invited, we've given one grant so far. It has gone through the entire process, and that was in the city of El Paso, Texas, of which they had substantial bond authority and a large program, and so we didn't go in and do an underwriting for them to see whether they had the dollars in the bank. But again, we're relatively new in implementing this program.
Oh, so you're saying, do you think a resolution would suffice or not?
Maybe. A letter of commitment of some
Yeah.
sorts without actually approving funding?
I don't know. The honest answer is a commitment at this stage. Well, the problem is we have to give our grant, and we give a grant of an amount not to exceed. Once we give that grant, we can't give more money.
Right.
So that's part of the problem. One potential option is we can narrow down the scope so that scope is the same, but I do not know. We don't have prior experience in doing this. So I would have to raise this back with the rest of our review committee.
So let me ask Bill a question. I mean, my experience when you get into planning is that by the time you spend your 6 to 9 months with an architect, let's say it's 6 months, but sometimes it's longer than that. Then you actually, your school board approves the plan. You go and you do your working drawings, which is another 6 months. You come up to DSA, which is another, 4 to 6 months. I mean, before you're even ready to, this is it. This is when everything goes smoothly. Then you go out to bid, and your project's usually out to bid for at least a month, sometimes 6 weeks, and you award the bid. And after you award the bid, there's certain things you have to verify and everything. So it's usually another month to 6 weeks before you get shovels in the ground. So if you take all that, you're almost 2 years down the road before you actually are building. And so that's why, I'm wondering if there's some way, we're talking about $6.6 million, if there's not a way that we can have a resolution by this board to include a Department of Defense carve-out in the next bond, and be able to then, because you're not, and you're and the difference between us and the Department of Defense is they fund up front, we fund on the match. So it seems to me that there ought to be a way that we could make this work.
Yeah,
I
think
I'm
you're right.
sorry.
That's okay. I think the timing of many of these projects is, just as you say, putting a lot of the work really starting a couple years out. So I think it may be a combination of a commitment by the board and the state to assist in the projects, and then developing the language that might go into the next bond, or a carve-out of some kind that could work for that. And as Ms. Silverman mentioned too, I think the issue of the eligibility question probably needs to get addressed within that, and that's going to be a key component also.
Well, to me, if you're talking about a next bond, the issue is greater than $6 million. That's $6 million of, we're dealing right now with $6 million of eligible project costs. But if we had our druthers and we were trying to really help, it's those other projects that don't have that because of varying circumstances. So it's more than the $6 million, I think, for a future bond. What I was hoping, and maybe I'll just try it with my colleagues here, if there's some support for that, we look at this $11 million, and that we look at the possibility of a regulatory change for a preliminary apportionment, which then means that we have made a commitment on that cost. The cash to follow it will be at the end of this program. We know that cash is being metered out. We're most likely going to be metering out cash 2 years from now on this program. They'd be at the bottom of the cash list, but they'd somehow we incorporate them into the list. We know the $4.8 million or whatever it is of Sierra Sands reimbursement that goes towards their 20%. They're pretty close, and if we have to consider money returning to the program, that they're the easiest one to assist with, I think, because they're so close to the edge of being able to be funded. The other ones that are not are their eligibility. They don't have a reimbursement project. They're starting this off right now for their remaining remaining $6 million, I think you said. If the board would entertain, bringing to the full board the possibility of a preliminary apportionment for that piece, and then I think for future pieces going forward, because not only are there these districts that don't have that I think fall into the new bond category now, there's going to be future projects that fall into the new bond category as DOD starts getting more funding and going down their list. Because didn't you say there's 7 more schools?
Four
more
next
California
7
schools
are in California
on their next tranche of the list, and so.
Well, I think that's perfectly fine to bring it to the full board as an option, but I think the option should include a DOD category, because
Of a future bond?
Yeah, because if we can use that as a match, and we can go forward with, having the $41 million and adding additional projects, and you're looking at a 4-to-1 match because they're paying 80%, I think that makes sense. So I don't know if that takes a commitment, a regulation change, or whatever, but it just seems to me that, yeah. And it's not, we've carved out larger amounts than that.
Assemblymember Hageman?
No, I think that's a good path to go on. I'm also going through some of these numbers. I think, first of all, can you tell me what the average of the last couple of funding ranges when we've gone to the more expediency? Yeah, I remember we had a lot of money coming back, and do we have a certain percentage that's been averaging out? Because we got a lot of money in the streets right now, too. And it's hard for me to sit there and say, I'm going to bump these guys up, even though they're the worthy cause, when everybody else is played by the rules as well. But we do generally get projects that don't go through sometimes, or, you know, we saw a lot of that come back before. But I don't know about this new program. You know, can we put them in, you know, we have this funding round that's closed, and we got the money out, and when there's people on the waiting list, and they've already earned their position, so to speak. But out of that next money, maybe coming back even,
Well, the challenge with the priorities and funding is, you're right, we have over a 99% success rate. And so we award projects, bonds to those products on that waiting list. So they come in with the mechanism, I can commit, and I can turn around a project in 90 days to access the cash. That's one thing, that's cash. But if they don't succeed in coming in for that fund release request, they lose the cash, but they don't lose their authority, because they get placed on the bottom of the unfunded list. So there is no mechanism to get that authority back for other projects in line. So in essence, even though they didn't get awarded the cash, they still get placed back on the unfunded list, but on the bottom of the unfunded list. So there is no one that's losing their authority for another project.
However, we are considering that very item at our next state allocation board meeting.
That's correct. That's correct. So there could be a mechanism put in place if the board chooses to go down that path in the future.
Because what happens is those projects, they may not be ready to start for 5 years, but they take up authority for other projects that could go.
Right.
Well, then, if I may, would my colleagues support the request to staff to bring back these two options, which aren't mutually exclusive, but two options to the full board in July. One concerning a preliminary apportionment, regulatory change, and one a potential for a recommendation for future bond funds. The preliminary apportionment affects the 11 million. The future bond funds could affect 11 plus 28, according to your chart. And in the intervening time, Mr. Hertzfeld, if you could also kind of check back with your people and see how they may react to that, so that we're prepared at our July meeting to do so. Does anyone have concerns around that?
No.
As good as we could do.
That's right.
Okay, that's unanimous. And unless there's further discussion that needs to happen, I can open it up for public comment of the subcommittee. Okay. Hearing none, then I will close the subcommittee hearing and see everyone in July.
Thank you.